The third wave experiment begins today. Listen closely.
It began like any other school day, spring 1967. At Cubberley High School in Palo Alto, California, students walked into history class expecting another routine lesson about Nazi Germany. No one knew that over the next 5 days, their classroom would become one of the most famous psychological experiments in modern history. Their teacher, Ron Jones, had one question he couldn't answer. How could millions of ordinary people willingly follow one of history's most brutal dictators? The lesson began with an unexpected question. A student slowly raised a hand. Mr. Jones, if the crimes of Nazi Germany were so obvious, how could millions of ordinary Germans later claim they knew nothing? The classroom fell silent. For a long moment, Ron Jones didn't answer. Instead, he slowly looked across the classroom. Every student waited. No one spoke. Somewhere, in that silence, an idea quietly began to form. Ron Jones realized that another lecture wouldn't answer the question. History wasn't failing these students. Experience was. So instead of explaining fascism, he decided they would experience it. Ron Jones realized that another lecture wouldn't answer the question. History wasn't failing these students. Experience was. So instead of explaining fascism, he decided they would experience it. Jones wasn't finished. He told the class that discipline wasn't about control. It was about strength. Every movement, every posture, every action would now be performed with purpose. Then the rules became stricter. Students had to stand before speaking. Every answer had to begin with Mr. Jones. Questions had to be short. Responses had to be precise. Without realizing it, the classroom was becoming more than a classroom. The next lesson introduced a new idea. Discipline makes individuals stronger, Jones told the class. But community makes everyone stronger. For the first time, the students stopped thinking of themselves as individuals. They were becoming part of something bigger. Then came a symbol. Ron Jones introduced a simple classroom salute. It wasn't forced, it wasn't complicated, but symbols have power. Within minutes, students were greeting one another with it as though it had always existed. Something unexpected happened. The rules didn't stay inside the classroom. Students began greeting each other with the salute in the hallways. Friends were invited to join. By the end of the week, what had started as a history lesson was beginning to look like a movement. By the third day, something remarkable had happened. Students who weren't even in the class wanted to join. Friends recruited friends. Desks filled quickly. The classroom became too small for the number of students who wanted to belong. The experiment was no longer spreading because of Ron Jones. It was spreading because the students themselves believed in it. As the movement grew, Ron Jones introduced something new. Everyone would have a responsibility. Some students welcomed visitors. Others kept attendance. A few were quietly asked to observe classmates and report anyone who failed to follow the rules. Without realizing it, the students had begun policing one another. Soon, the movement had a name. Ron Jones called it the third wave. Students no longer thought of themselves as just classmates. They proudly identified themselves as members. What had started as a classroom exercise was rapidly becoming part of their identity. Within just a few days, the third wave was no longer confined to one classroom. Students who had never attended Ron Jones' history class wanted to become members. They recruited friends. They greeted each other in the hallways. What began with a few dozen students quickly grew into hundreds. The movement was now spreading on its own. Then, something changed. Students began reporting classmates who questioned the movement. Some did it because they believed they were protecting the group. Others simply didn't want to be left out. Without being ordered, the members of the third wave had begun policing themselves. The experiment was no longer being controlled by Ron Jones alone. Then came the next rule. Mr. Jones introduced a simple salute. It wasn't just a greeting anymore. It became a symbol of belonging. Every student was expected to use it whenever they greeted another member of the class. What surprised Ron Jones most was that he no longer had to remind students to use the salute. They greeted one another with it in the hallways. Before class, after school, the behavior was spreading on its own. The experiment had taken on a life of its own. Membership wasn't enough anymore. Students were encouraged to bring others into the movement. Some recruited close friends, others invited complete strangers. Joining the third wave quickly became something students wanted to be part of. The movement was now growing faster than Ron Jones could control. Soon, joining the third wave no longer felt like a choice. Students wanted to belong. Those who joined felt accepted. Those who hesitated began to feel different. Without threats, without punishment, peer pressure was quietly doing the work. On the fifth day, Ron Jones made an extraordinary announcement. He told the class that the third wave was not just a classroom experiment. It was part of a growing national youth movement. Across America, other students were supposedly organizing under the same ideals. Tomorrow, he said, the national leader would reveal himself during a live television broadcast. The classroom erupted with anticipation. None of the students realized they were walking into the final lesson. The next day, the classroom was overflowing. Students arrived early. Some stood along the walls because every seat was taken. Everyone stared at the television. They waited for the leader of the third wave to appear. 1 minute passed. Then another, the screen remained blank. The room slowly filled with confusion. Finally, Ron Jones stepped forward. He looked around the silent classroom. Then he spoke. There is no national movement. There is no leader. There is no television broadcast. The room fell completely silent. The students stared back in disbelief. In just 5 days, they had willingly surrendered their independence because they wanted to belong. Ron Jones let the silence settle. Then he explained why he had done it. In only 5 days, ordinary students had accepted strict rules, embraced a shared identity, and surrendered independent thinking without ever being forced. He told them that this was how authoritarian movements often begin, not with violence, but with belonging, with discipline, with the desire to be part of something bigger than yourself. The third wave lasted only 5 days, but its lesson has endured for decades. The experiment showed that authoritarianism doesn't always begin with fear. Sometimes it begins with discipline, with belonging, with the comfort of following the crowd instead of asking difficult questions. Ron Jones didn't prove that his students were different from everyone else. He proved they were exactly like everyone else, because the desire to belong is one of the most powerful forces in human nature. The third wave was a real classroom experiment conducted by teacher Ron Jones in 1967 at Cubberley High School in Palo Alto, California. Its lesson remains relevant today. Question authority. Think critically. Never surrender your ability to think for yourself. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy thoughtful documentaries exploring psychology, history, and human behavior, subscribe for more.